think all of our assumptions about who buys what we're selling, who we've designed this thing for, and why we think it's important and valuable are all assumptions that we have. We need to constantly retest and reevaluate. You either need to have someone help you do this, or you need to be able to effectively do it yourself, which is to step back and say, like, what is the journey people are going through? Because you can map it out and try to get a sense of that and try to get an understanding of things like in the aggregate. But if you're not layering in like individual kind of stories, you're not going to fully understand. It's always important to orient back to that because I think your assumptions stack over time. And if you're not kind of also stacking it with validation of that or contradiction, then you're only ever stacking assumptions, I think, about what it is this thing you're trying to do and who you're trying to do it for.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Forget the Funnel podcast, where our goal is to help you as a SaaS leader finally stop guessing, understand your best customers, and drive more predictable recurring revenue. We're Gia and Claire, founders of Forget the Funnel, a product marketing and growth consultancy that helps SaaS businesses learn from their best customers, map and measure their experiences, and unlock their best levers for growth. If you're looking to help your team make smarter decisions, this show is for you. Hey everyone, it's Gia here. Today, our guest is Dan Stuart, president of EverCommerce companies, Invoice Simple, and more recently, Joist. We've worked with Dan and the incredible team at Invoice Simple for a little while now, so we were eager to have him join us on the podcast. Dan is a serial entrepreneur, having founded and led 2 successful startups to exit before taking up the role of president at Invoice Simple last year. Invoice Simple is a tool that makes it easy for small and micro businesses on the go to send invoices and get paid. In this chat, Dan shares the moment he realized that the customer data his team was relying on to make growth decisions wasn't actually helping them make real progress, the importance of continually validating core beliefs about your product, and the advice he would give to other SaaS leaders to get out of their own way and capture business-critical insights. Dan is one of the most thoughtful and insightful leaders we've had the privilege to work with, and we're sure you'll learn a ton in this episode from his experience. But first, a quick message. For well over a decade, Claire and I have been helping teams at companies like Bitly, Wistia, Postman, Linktree, Invoice Simple, Sprout Social, and Autobooks stop guessing, gain more clarity around what matters to customers, and dramatically improve conversions. In 2019, Claire and I developed the customer-led growth framework that to date has helped thousands of founders, marketing, and product leaders get out of the weeds, think more strategically about their product marketing, and meaningfully impact revenue growth. And we wrote a book about it so that you can too. Rather than a toolbox, this book gives you a system to follow so that you can choose the tools that are actually right for your company, your team, and your customers. This book will help you make better decisions about what to implement, when, and how. And once you're done with the book, there's a 110-page workbook that'll help you connect the dots between learning customer-led growth and implementing it within your company. Before you waste another minute or dollar frantically taking action, and if you're honest, guessing, search for Forget the Funnel on Amazon and grab your copy of the paperback, ebook, or audiobook. To kick off the conversation, we're going to make this really easy. We're going to ask you to talk about just what Invoice Simple is and what problem does it solve and for who?
Yeah, Invoice Simple. So what it is, kind of in the name, it's one of those ones where it's pretty straightforward. I mean, we do estimates, invoices, and digital payments for micro businesses. So by and large, people that have businesses less than 9 headcount. That said, we're on kind of the micro end of the micro business segment. So 70-80% of customers are 3 headcount or less. Most of the people doing these things full time, but certainly for people doing freelance work as well too, but by and large full time. And really across industries, anything from home services to digital services to selling products to car mechanics to all kinds of things like in between, and really anywhere. We have no geographic limitations on the product. So name a country and we have more than a few people using the product there as well too. And mainly what they're trying to get done is people that are trying to go from analog processes of collecting payments or sending out like a request for payment, looking that bit more professional, automating processes, using things in a reusable way. But generally, I'll come back to the first point and say, just trying to look more professional and stay more organized doing it.
Awesome. Tell us a bit about your role. It doesn't necessarily have to be title per se, but your role, and also what does that role entail? We often describe this as like what keeps you up at night. So what are your responsibilities? What are you focused on day to day? What is your focus?
I mean, my role's changed a bit here over time. I joined here as the head of product, and then within the first couple of days, I became the head of product and engineering. So I ran product and engineering, became the president of Invoice Simple, and now I have another product that I look after as well, very similar. And so essentially what I worry about is, it sounds basic to say, but how do we grow the business in a way that continues to kind of anchor in what we're solving and who we're solving it for, essentially, right? And so there's no radical shift in terms of who we're serving. I think it's just learning more and more about our customers. I think what keeps me up at night is those pieces about, we talk to customers often. I was struck with a call I was on the other day I was listening into, and I think sometimes we get caught up in the idea that everyone wants to grow their business. And it was an interesting conversation because it was an electrician in Wisconsin talking about how when they were younger, they wanted to grow their business, and it was about bidding on large jobs and hiring more people and having more vans. And now that he's been in business for a few decades, it's working with the same people, having a stable income for him and the few people he works with, and really spending honestly less time on the administrative side of his business. So really his view has changed. And so I think what that means to me is, first of all, trying to understand that person specifically and how many people are like him and different than him and different aspirations, and how many of those different that we can solve and serve. And that most people that come to us are about trying to make things easier and simpler. And, you're always kind of worried about, well, if time goes by, you're adding more to the product, you're doing more things. Are you giving up that simplicity? Are you moving away from that core group that really helped the business be successful? You don't want to leave anybody behind, and you want to continue to serve them. And I think that's this tension we're constantly going through, is how do we try to help more without actually being less helpful to the people that we resonated with early on.
It reminds me, Gia, you've heard me use this phrase before, but there was a head of product we worked with at one point who described it as this person had come on board at a company where the product had a very, very broad range of customers, similar to Invoice Simple, different space. But their main objective in coming on was to help the product team transition from what this person called like being a feature factory to really zooming in and understanding what is the core value provided, and how can they carve away all of the noise within the product itself to help people get to that core value and realize it long term. And it sounds like I'm hearing something very similar here, where your focus is less on how can we make the product bigger and better and faster and shinier, and more, how can we just stay very, very true to that main value? Did I get that right, or am I off?
Yeah, you actually made me think of something. I'm going to go this direction for a second, if that's okay, and say we were certainly not a feature factory. We were actually probably more of a data factory. Before I joined, we were incredibly experimentation driven, incredibly data driven, to the point of being very successful doing so. I mean, the business grew very well, has continued to grow very well, but most of the interaction with the customer was through the aggregate performance of an experiment, or like a price change or things like that, much more so than the one-by-one conversations or a small count but statistically significant surveys and things like that. And so I think that's one of the things that's certainly changed. We didn't start talking to customers, and I'm generalizing, right? It's not like we didn't talk to customers, but like it wasn't so much of a thing. We started doing it and staffed up to do it before we all started working together. But this has just been another like key inflection point of that, and had really positive benefits that way as well too. But it's not like we stopped looking at data and stopped running experiments. On the contrary, but certainly added a stronger piece to it, in that sense. And the value, obviously, right? It's not just what people do, it's what they say and how they say it and how they describe things and the words they use and everything else. And we were missing that piece in a lot of ways. And that wasn't really coming through as much in a pure experimentation-driven approach to growth.
Can I dig in one little thing that you mentioned there, Dan? So you were talking about experimentation. I'm curious to hear more about how you measure success on the whole. Like, what are the metrics that you look at on a day-to-day or week-to-week, depending on how obsessive you are?
Yeah, it's a few different things. I mean, some of the measures we look at that are vital to the business are obviously customer acquisition is key for what we do. We're very much like we're a classic SaaS business. What do I mean? I mean that monthly and annual plans, very PLG SaaS, buy it on your own. Not only do we not have any sales staff, you can't even call us. We do inbound text-based support, email and chat. That's it. But we do try to measure a lot of things when we look at. So obviously customer acquisition is key, churn is key for us too. Reasons for churn. Because we operate on the micro end of the micro business segment, I mean, we need to succeed in an end of the market where there's probably 30% business churn on an annual basis. And so that's something we're trying to validate and understand, but also see if we can shift a bit as well too, right? I mean, hopefully the more successful we can make somebody, hopefully the less likely they are to be a business churn. Customer churn different. We can try to address that and do different things. Business churn, it's harder to get at, but it's how we try to think about business health, but it's also harder to measure. So obviously we look at customer acquisition, we look at customer retention. Obviously we're trying to see how people move through the funnel. We have a very wide top of funnel. A lot of investments in the past made towards organic traffic acquisition, but also from an app store perspective too. And so single digit percentage point changes in our funnel have very meaningful impacts on the business. And obviously we have a payments business as well too, where people can choose to use our payments to settle their invoices. That's a bit newer for us. So it has its own set of kind of metrics as well too. But then linking those things together, trying to understand the highest level of customer acquisition through to invoicing usage into like payments as well too. And so, but very classic PLG SaaS in terms of kind of the core metrics we look at.
But you do have a combination of the two. You've got those traditional SaaS metrics, and then you also have metrics that are related to this particular payments functionality, which is more about revenue like per transaction. So you have a hybrid model that you're thinking about and trying to build a customer experience around. And you already knew at that point then that there was something missing in the like more data and aggregate approach. You knew there was like a level of closeness with customers missing. And this may be too far back for you to recall, but I'm curious, do you remember what happened that led you to realize, okay, the data we have isn't getting us as far as it could? Where was the switch? Where was the inflection point?
Yeah, I think it was a few things. So we had brought on, in no particular order, we had brought on a researcher at that point. And so it's interesting, like looking back, I mean, I've had a few businesses of my own, like I should have hired a researcher in all of them. And it went from being, why do we need a researcher to we don't have enough researchers. All of a sudden it became so valuable internally and to the point where we'll continue to expand that moving forward because I have to turn down things that we want to do internally because we don't have enough bandwidth there. And we have a couple actually now. So quick aside, but that was part of that. And really try to engage with the customer. I mean, I've worked with similar kinds of customers for a long time, local service professionals that sound a certain way, that live a certain way, that are very different by industry, are very different by geography and different things. And so in the aggregate, you can't hear what your customer sounds like. You can't hear them describe in their own words what they're trying to get done. No one tells you, hey, you know what I really need is an expense tracking tool. What they say is things like, it's sometimes a struggle to understand if I charged enough for this job to know if I made any money. And so the more you hear that phrasing, the more you try to understand it that way, you're just going to be that much more successful, right? And I think also too is that we're doing a lot of experimentation. A couple of things that were a big catalyst for me is that one is that we didn't have a very good view, kind of a lot of resources building our funnel, a lot of resources executing our product and some experiments that kind of almost worked as threads through the funnel as opposed to say a coordinated view amongst the different groups that work there. And so I was working with the people that are involved here to try to get us there, but working together became probably a catalyst to bring the different groups together that work down, building funnel, nurturing down through, down into like transaction and that's activation, success, retention, et cetera, right? And so it almost became like the construct or the box or the shape or the something that kind of brought everybody together, or the backbone maybe is a better way to say it, that all those different groups got to kind of come together, rather rally against. And that became the process that we worked through from our core invoicing funnel and subscription funnel. And then obviously we did that a second time with the payments product as well too, which I would describe in the same way as well and having the same needs where we were looking at those things, but I think we needed to like catalyze like those groups coming together to really look at that in a coordinated way. And that was one of the roles that you all played in that was super helpful.
There's so many things you said that are so relatable and that are just inherent challenges that a team faces as a product grows and evolves and as a customer base scales, but particularly the idea of the team focused on acquisition and top of funnel, having one view and having a set of programs that they're running, and then the team focused on product and activation and churn reduction having a different view and having different programs they're running. And over time, everyone is focused on the targets or the KPIs that their function is responsible for, but it can be really, really hard to have the team step out of that and look at what actually happens from the customer's perspective. It can be so hard to see like, whoa, we're running this and it says these things, and it actually kind of runs into or is counter to this other program over here, and it's creating confusion like that. That is a very, very relatable challenge, I guess is what I'm getting at. And Gia, I know you've seen that as well with different teams we've worked with. I mean, part of the reason that we're such big advocates of building out a customer experience map that is more reflective of the customer and less reflective of like, what is the buying journey or what is the funnel versus what does churn look like, et cetera, where when you build an experience map that's more about those internal metrics, it can kind of fuel that siloing or that disconnection versus having everyone focused on like, okay, here's what happens from beginning through to end.
This is going to sound horrible, and I'm not saying that this is the way we do things necessarily, but like as soon as you have teams focused on different aspects of things, right? It's almost like one team is filling a bag, and then the next team comes along and kind of reaches in the bag. Let's see what's there. And there's not that kind of clear view of like, oh, great, you brought these customers. Now let's see if there's something else, or now let's see who needs us, or let's see who pokes their head out, when they need something or whatever. And it's that to have that view, like, because even like people talk about having growth teams, right? And some people have them when they don't need them, and a lot of people don't have them when they do need them. And there's probably a few people out there that actually have them when they need them. We've probably been somewhat of a victim of this, where we'll have a growth team, but it's more of a customer acquisition and monetization team, right? Rather than looking at like growth across the product in different places and trying to like realize more value out of the existing features and value of the product and things. And I'm all for just call it what it is, because it also orients towards not just the KPIs and metrics, but also like who you're kind of holding hands with on either side. Where do you sit in that workflow? And it's somewhat easier said than done sometimes. We're going through planning for next year right now, and it's the same kind of thing. Like as soon as you're doing integrated planning, not just within teams or functional areas, but you're trying to do it across strategic pillars, they should be by nature cross-functional. So every time you do it, it reminds you that it's not as natural for most of the people involved as it should be, because it's really around, again, I call it strategic pillars, but it's probably jobs. It's also, ideal customers and, who buys today, who do you want to buy? Or those two things are slightly different. What do you do about it? And then to simplifying, right? There's a lot of different people involved in answering that question, figuring out what those two things even mean, but then answering that question as well too. And it's all worth doing. And I think the more things that are either done through internal kind of motivation and impetus, or sometimes bring someone external that forces this kind of cross-functional rallying around outcomes and resources, is both money and time, and creates expectations, but expectations of outcomes and things too. Like sometimes you just need that to create that. And it's not just, again, about the time and the shape, but it's also about kind of the value and the insights and fresh eyes and people that are well invested in it as well too.
Well, and I would argue it's in many cases, it's not even that the internal team like lacks the skill set or the ability to do that, but everyone's got their own priorities that they're already focused on. And so to ask somebody to champion that work internally is to kind of ask them to take on like a second job on top of what they're actually responsible for accomplishing, which can be really challenging. This view of being closer to the customer as an individual was a thing. It was a need. Thankfully, Gia happened to guest on a podcast at the right time that teed that conversation up internally. And then we did embark on trying to uncover that closer view of who is a great Invoice Simple customer. We came up with 2 jobs to be done, or 2 reasons that people hire Invoice Simple, both good use cases, but one that represented a likely longer tail customer or higher retention customer. So there were people who were just getting started with their business. And so they had this need to invoice for the first time. And then there were people who their business was growing to the point at which, however they were doing invoicing before was no longer working. And like you said, home services, contractors, very micro, they're likely out in the field or on the go, and they need something that they can very quickly pull up, generate from their phone, and not think about it again. What was the difference maker in learning those 2 different reasons that people hire the product? Did that uncover any aha moments for the team? Did that have implications that people hadn't been aware of prior?
Arguably, there's 3 big buckets our customers hypothetically would fall into. They're just starting out, they're growing their business, or they're neither one of those 2 and just honestly want to spend more time, taking the wedding photos and not sending invoices and running their business and the time they get back. And so I think, I know when, because I've been here for about 2 years, almost exactly, but I know when I first joined, there's a lot of conversation too around, are we serving the kind of just starting out crowd, even like startup activities and things like that? And should we be supporting more of that? Think of all the things that you do when you start a business, right? Everything, not even the fun things like website and everything else. Some of it's just like legal and contracts and all those things. And I think this was interesting because the two we looked at were this idea of starting up and this idea of growing. And I would say probably just in conversation, maybe starting up was like winning a bit or ahead a bit in terms of more kind of like strategic conversations internally. And I think we ended up focusing here on the growing business segment, and people want to grow their business. And I think that was a big shift in terms of how we thought about things, but also how we also thought about how it cascaded into the rest of our business as well too, and how it really oriented/reoriented our thinking about how we thought about building for those needs, how we thought about even thinking about how we nurture customers through, how we describe what we do, the wording, the language that we use, who we talk to and everything else. And I think that was the key kind of orientation. And I think that significantly shifted about how we think about growth opportunities. Obviously, that was one version of doing that. And so we need to continue to revalidate that as well and be open to see if that's changing. And also ask ourselves, what does that mean? Right? I mean, back to who buys it and who do you want to buy it? And are those two things the same? And who are you best able to serve? And so we'll continue to revalidate that and continue to research and learn into that. But that was a big shift for us, I think, just in terms of how we approach kind of the day to day around who we were serving and how we were doing it.
I remember a big distinction too between the two groups were like what they're switching away from or the decision-making process, right? A business who is just starting up, as you mentioned, they're thinking about maybe their website, maybe a logo. More likely they're thinking about like legal, getting their paperwork in order. But for a business that's not starting up, a business that's thinking about the sort of dead weight of doing things the old way, and the pain and associated with that and the struggle there, which was also, so that was part of what was so interesting about that group of customers, was that they were feeling a real need. It wasn't like, I'm just starting up my business and I have a bunch of things that I need to research. These growing businesses were laser focused on this like dead weight they were carrying around of using spreadsheets or word processors, or in some cases like an over-engineered solution, but in all cases like a cumbersome process that they didn't want to be using anymore. And I think one of the things that we were the most excited about when we were working on that was like the stark contrast that they could get excited about when it comes to Invoice Simple. Thus the reinforcement of like, the name says it all. So many of these customers were like, but the name says it. That's what I was looking for, because they were looking for a simpler invoicing solution versus like their first invoicing solution. That was a big, for us anyway, that was a big draw towards that group, is that there's an urgent actual problem that people are actively seeking out a solution for, which was cool to see.
And the time to evaluate too, I think that to me is whenever doing anything to this level of depth, invariably I've had, where the time, I guess I thought I'd had as a business to achieve certain kind of milestones or with a customer is very different than what it actually is. I remember my last business, we thought we had 6 weeks to reach a certain point, and it turned out we had 7 days, and that once we understood that, it radically shifted like our thinking. And in this case too, I remember just anecdotes through this process where people were saying, I thought I'd give it 3 minutes, and if I could figure it out, then it'd be good, or whatever. Like, it wasn't like, well, I'll try this for a month, or, I'll send 10 invoices or something. It's like, I'll give it 3 minutes. If I can set it up quickly, then I'll keep going. To me, again, it's like just this real reinforcement that what you think is probably true. And because you think it's true, you act based on that, right? And once you kind of reorient, even like not even key activities, but timelines and time frames, that to me is very powerful. And that was one of the things that really hit home with me too, is just that people would evaluate, but sometimes you get a couple minutes, and that's it. Different products, I'm sure people will give it different times, but I mean, you're not going to jump into something called Invoice Simple and feel like you have to give it 7 hours to figure out if it's going to work for you or not, right? So we kind of set the expectation ourselves, that, yeah, you know what, 3 minutes might be just enough, and that you can figure out if this is for you. I guess it's a good reminder that I just made it sound super obvious when I just kind of said it out loud like that, linked it together. But I guess sometimes you need someone's help to get to the obvious, right?
You do. And when we're like going back to thinking about customer data or user data in aggregate, it's much harder to really feel confident that you know what that timeline really is. It's difficult to get to that level of nuance until you're on a call with someone and they're like, yeah, I was in my truck and I was tired of like messing with Word on my phone. And so I went to search like invoices. And of course, I wasn't going to give it more than 3 to 5 minutes. I had to send the invoice then. That context becomes so much more obvious once you're having those real conversations. Data in aggregate is definitely very powerful, especially when we're talking about changes of 1 to 2% making massive revenue impact. There's a level of nuance that gets lost if you don't also have more like one-to-one customer understanding in tandem with it. So yes, you made it sound obvious, but it's surprisingly not obvious a lot of the times. I thought it was interesting you describing like the understanding of the timeline being much clearer. And maybe I'm a little too in the weeds, but I'm curious if there's any other like examples that come to mind of how that new understanding has changed what the team is working on or impacted customer programming, anything like that. How you engage, how you instrument, maybe how the team has like chosen priorities or what to focus on. Could be external or internal.
So we used to use a lot of different systems to message our customers. Message can mean lots of different things. It wasn't because anyone decided, hey, we should have 4 different ways to send these different things. It just became like over time, right? You just
gradual layering on, right? Like
yeah. And so we used kind of the outcomes of like the first sprint we went through to then say, well, if we're going to go and implement new kind of nurture cycles, essentially, it's probably a good opportunity to do that thing we've been talking about doing, which is to go and consolidate this into a new tool that lets us do kind of multi-channel messaging and things in a much smarter way, where we have a clean single view of the customer. We can better personalize based on their preferences, channel timing, things like that. And so that certainly became where we were opportunistic to be able to do that at the same time. And so we've now done that, and it makes everything we do now moving forward. So would we have done it anyway? Probably. Would we have done it exactly then? Maybe not. Looking back, it just became very good timing to do it that way, and a good impetus to say, well, look, if we have all these great artifacts from, that we now want to implement, we should probably just do it in the kind of best in class tool that we were going to move to anyway at some point, and just do all these things now. We've already started doing things that we've already made the time. We've already carved out this from what maybe we would have done otherwise and things. So we're already here. We're already stopped, as the case may be. Let's do all these things now and have just, move forward with a really just kind of like solid both channels and tools, but also just like the messages that go along with it.
So it's like you collectively already knew that was a direction that the tool stack or the tech stack should move in. And this was kind of like a positive forcing function to be like, well, we've come this far. We've learned these things. We may as well make that shift happen while we're in this mode.
Yeah, we were going to do it a year ago and didn't. And I mean, I think part of it was because that was about the tool, whereas this became not just about the tool, but became about also the actual outcomes of this new kind of approach to like messaging and things. And so, yeah, it was much better timing this time around.
One of the things that I was curious about is the like any skepticisms that you may have experienced when being introduced to the process or during the process. I wonder if something like that came up for you, Dan, when we were working together.
I think, look, on a high level, someone's going to, might look at this and say, so we have marketing, we have product marketing, we have researcher, we have product managers, so arguably we have all the functions that could conceivably do all these things ourselves, right? So why didn't we do it ourselves? It's time, it's capability. You can't possibly have all the skills and capabilities within even larger teams, let alone smaller teams, to be able to do things, a certain way. And that's where you go and you gain both time and expertise. It's a matter of bringing together those groups, having that time, capability, and expertise as an aid to those groups. Like, I'd like to think someone's going to push us and then we'll kind of just keep riding, where it's a great way to kind of level up the team and get thoughts, approach, orientation towards a specific approach that I think that should have long leg and lasting value and implementation within the business that we can apply. It's not like a one-off, right? This is the kind of muscles you want to build and maintain. And so my metaphors are all over the place, but I think hopefully they ring true that it was not meant to be, hey, we'll do this for a bit and then it's done. It's like, well, no, this is good expertise and capability added to the team. It'll help us level up. We'll learn some things. We'll gain some things in the short term, but we'll hopefully learn some things that we can apply ourselves like over the longer term as well too.
I would double down on the time benefit there, because again, as you mentioned, the team has been very successful with experimentation in the past and achieving solid outcomes. It's not as if internally people may not have been capable, but that time element of it is a huge constraint when internally people do have their own KPIs that they are responsible for progressing toward, or other projects that are already on their plate. And it can be very hard to carve out additional time for this level of gathering the customer insight. So I think that makes a ton of sense. I think in a number of different ways, Dan, you've already said this, but the gathering of this more in-depth customer insight as a complement to that customer data in aggregate, what would you say is the big problem that really solves if we had to boil it down?
I think with the bringing together this specific work that we did here and really bringing very specific kind of voice to customer, both where we start with from a survey perspective, use it to narrow down audiences and then engage one-on-one with customers specifically and really deep dive into each of these there. I think what we really end up with is, it's a big reason why we did this in the first place. We get both the, I'll call it like the short-term deliverable or outcome of these like specific interviews, which guide what we do. But I think it's also a reaffirmation of just the importance of just talking to people. We talk about it all the time, the importance of doing it. I think it's also way too easy not to do it, or to not make time for it, or to get too busy for it, or different things. And almost every time I've had a conversation with a customer, I've been, most of my responses are in my head is, wow, that was great. And we can never do enough of that. And I think to me, this was, again, we got the benefit of those specific interviews, but we also got that reaffirmation just of the importance of this spread across everybody who was involved.
As you, I'm sure, have peers in the space that are, Dan, from pre this type of work, if they're struggling with the same things that, again, pre this type of work Dan was struggling with, what would you say to them? How would you help them get out of their own way and make progress with this type of approach? Or what might sort of lower the barrier to entry, you think, for folks like you struggling again with the same type of thing that you were struggling with prior?
I mean, I've had businesses that were 5 days old and 5 years old, and this one's older than that. And I think all of our assumptions about who buys what we're selling, who we've designed this thing for, and why we think it's important and valuable are all assumptions that we have. We need to constantly retest and reevaluate. You either need to have someone help you do this, or you need to be able to effectively do it yourself, which is to step back and say, like, what is the journey people are going through? Because you can map it out and try to get a sense of that and try to get an understanding of things like in the aggregate. But if you're not layering in like individual kind of stories, you're not going to fully understand. It's always important to orient back to that, because I think your assumptions stack over time. And if you're not kind of also stacking it with validation of that or contradiction, then you're only ever stacking assumptions, I think, about what it is this thing you're trying to do and who you're trying to do it for.
Dan, we're so grateful, obviously, that you've spent this time, but it's also, I'm really excited for other folks to hear this and benefit from the wisdom. And I guess just to sort of wrap up, maybe what would be helpful. I mean, typically at the end of a podcast, we would say, like, how can people reach you? But I'm a little bit more interested in, like, how could people help you? If there's anything a listener, because I think this is going to be a really helpful conversation for other folks like you to hear. So if there's anything that listeners could help you with, what would it be?
I mean, if I can be helpful at all, I mean, this is not what you asked me, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. There's probably, in my head at least, for better or for worse, probably an hour for every 5 minutes, more about what I was talking about, in just terms of like things that, why we did certain things, what we've gained out of it, what we still hope to gain out of it, things we probably didn't leverage as well as we could. But also just as I think back in my own past about working for other people's businesses and starting two of my own, and just how I would now, hindsight, do things differently in a lot of cases, like meaningfully so. So I'm going to kind of answer your question in a different way and say, it's actually incredibly helpful for me to be prompted to think about these things this way too, and have to be able to talk about it. because I've actually learned some things just by answering your questions, because it makes me rethink and formulate like why we're doing these things. But also, honestly, I'm also thinking we probably haven't done enough with this yet. There's more we can do with this other thing. We might be done certain things, but we're not really done. This is this constant learning process. And now, like I said, we're going through planning right now. So all these things are resonating even more with me. So, I mean, to be honest, if people have like questions or follow-up or want to dig in more on how I might think about it in other scenarios, happy to do that, because selfishly I'll gain from it too, because I just honestly do, just from being forced to think about it this way, because half the time I'm talking, but the other time I'm thinking about, well, yeah, we should do more about this as well too.
Way to flip it on its head.
What's your greatest weakness? I care too much.
Exactly. Thanks for that.
I truly don't think we can say thank you enough, though. You're a very busy person, and this was like so appreciated. So thanks for taking the time. And that's it for this episode of the Forget the Funnel podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions about the topics we covered, don't hesitate to contact Gia or myself on LinkedIn. And you can also visit our website at forgetthefunnel.com. This is still a new podcast for us, so ratings, reviews, and subscriptions in your podcast platform of choice make a huge difference. See you next time.